So I want to discuss the use of line art. Now some of you might come to this video thinking that the use of line art is just a stylistic choice, and that the choice basically boils down to imagining the same scene with line art and then without it, and then picking the scene that looks the best. But I don't think it's that simple. Take a look at this scene. It looks fairly nice. We have these nice rocks and then some bushes. And if we look at these bushes, we can with minimal effort actually see where each asset starts and ends. Here's one asset, then another, then another. So while the scene has a lot of assets, it's still quite relaxing to look at. But look at what happens to this scene if I remove the line art. These rocks still look fine, the hills and the trees still look nice, but if we stop and look at what happened to these bottom assets here, it looks messy. I can technically still see where each asset begins and ends, but now it requires effort. While this asset and this asset each look quite fine without line art, when we stack them next to each other, it looks bad because the assets are so similar in color and, more importantly, similar in value. And that makes it so that it becomes hard for us to distinguish and separate them. Compare that to pretty much the same assets but with line art. Now if we put them next to each other, the black line art actually helps the player see this separation. This might make it seem as if having line art is just easier. The separation between assets clearly becomes better, and that's a good thing, right? Well, no. The truth is that instead of showing you this scene, I could have showed you this scene in Itora, which has quite a bit going on, but the lack of line art actually works to its advantage. If each strand here did have line art, this scene would be chaotic. We can see this if we look at this scene. This scene has colored line art, slightly darker than the rest of the asset, but still fairly light. But look at what happens if we turn this line art black. Now most of the scene looks fine, but right here at the edge, this actually becomes weirdly messy. We stop being able to separate each asset, and instead all we see is line art. In general, when you don't have line art, I feel that you need to be careful with the separation between assets so that you ensure that the assets don't blend together. Conversely, black line art often has the opposite problem, where it really does help you separate assets from each other, but any detail in the middle of the asset can easily overpower and become cluttered and distracting, especially if the rest of the asset is fairly light, which is why I personally generally prefer adding colored line art. It helps adding distinction between assets, but doesn't add so much contrast that it becomes distracting. And with colored line art you can actually go one step further and color the outside line art with more contrast, and the inside line art with less contrast. That way you remove some of the clutter inside the asset, but still highlight the separation between assets. Now, does this mean that colored line art is the best way to go? Definitely not. First of all, we can see in an example like this, how while this scene is slightly less cluttered, it also has a very different mood. And for some of you, this is the opposite of what you want. And just because it solves a tiny problem with clutter in a neat way, it isn't the only way to solve that problem. If you watched my last video, you would have seen this scene where I used colored line art for the bushes. Now if we look at this scene with black line art, we can see that it still looks fine. Slightly more cluttered, but not so bad it becomes annoying. So this works because we already have decent separation, and we have paid attention to our negative space. But here we could also increase the separation without changing the line art. We could for instance add a low opacity filter between the platforms and the background. Now we reduce the contrast and the separation becomes better. But we can also solve this problem another way. The line art here only really becomes distracting because the asset itself is quite bright, whereas the line art is black. We're getting contrast where we don't want it. But suppose we don't make our assets quite as bright. Then we really don't have this problem, which we can see in a scene like this. We have all black line art, but the transition between the black line art and the color of the asset isn't that big. So it doesn't become that distracting and the scene works fine even if there is a lot of detail. We have detail here, but we don't have a lot of contrast here. The biggest contrast is still between the platforms and the background. Well, what I want to say with all of this is that the tricky thing with making a video like this is that if I show you a cluttered scene like this and say it's cluttered and that you should remove detail, then that is obvious. It's obvious to anyone. But if I show you a scenario like this, it's significantly less obvious if you need to do anything about it. In this scenario, I think it's fine exactly like it is. But if you look at a scene with significantly thicker line art like this, it looks cool, but to me these bushes become slightly distracting, and I start to prefer pushing them back a bit. So I personally prefer this to this, but as I said, all of this becomes slightly nuanced. I just want you to think about it. Now I'm framing this as a discussion between line art and not line art. But it's not an inherent discussion about line art in itself, but rather a question of too poor separation and too much separation, which we can see if we look at games like Salt and Sanctuary, which I would argue has too poor separation, and then we can contrast that with Aeternal Noctis, which often has too much separation. Depending on the style you choose, and depending on whether you use harsh line art or not, you're gonna end up with either having too much separation and too much clutter, or not enough separation, and your game becomes sort of muddled and too soft. Both of these extremes are bad, and we kind of want to focus on creating negative space and allowing our composition to shine through. Now, with all of this said, if you don't have that many assets stacked on top of each other, and you have quite decent contrast in your assets without using line art, then I think line art largely does become a matter of taste. We can look at this scene. Even if I remove the line art, I can still see and understand the scene perfectly well. I prefer having line art here, but it still kind of looks fine without it. Similarly, we can get scenes where the difference between black line art like this and colored line art like this makes a small difference, but not a big enough difference that it outright makes your art bad. This looks fine, but this also looks fine. Or we can see in this scene, all three styles work, it's just a matter of mood and taste. It does alter the scene significantly, but none of it looks bad. So is this it? Well, no. As I said, from an artistic point of view, you can use line art with great effect and avoid using line art to an equally great effect. The reason I personally use line art has nothing at all to do with style in itself, it has to do with time. What do I mean by this? Well, if you look at an asset like this one, it is made with 3 or 4 layers. The first is just a flat color, and it looks horrible, which means it's quick to draw. Similarly with my shading, just a big blob with an airbrush and some smoothing. It looks horrible, but it's quick to draw. And then on top of this, we have my line art, which hides all that horrible part and makes the entire thing look neat, which makes it quick to draw. But I want us to look at what happens when I draw a bush like this without line art. First, we have me starting out doing this kind of sloppy shape with some shading. And we can see here that these edges of the bush look a bit too soft and unclean. So now I have to clean that edge here. But at the same time, I need to smooth out this part in order for it to blend well with the rest of the asset. And then I have to clean the edges of the asset in order to make it look sharp. Hopefully you agree that if I start out with this, I kind of need to get to this point in order to be satisfied. And you can see that there are quite a bit of added layers of fixing and smoothing that needs to be done in order to get here. But when I use line art, I can sit with this messy shape and these soft edges and just cover it with line art, and now you don't notice the mess. So in reality, I would be about equally happy with both of these states. I think both versions look nice and polished, but when I don't have line art, I need to think about all these transitions and fix them. This is not quick for me to draw. You can imagine that if I can draw this asset in very few strokes and only have 3 layers instead of 6, then I can cut my drawing time in half. It's frankly the same reason I only draw on full opacity. The less I have to paint, the fewer strokes I have to cover the same area, the quicker it goes. Now it is possible to do quick and nice assets without using line art, but I'm frankly not that good at it. And I do want you to be aware of the fact that game art is always a tug of war between quality and time. Suppose this asset takes 15 minutes to draw, this asset takes 14 minutes, and this asset takes 22 minutes. Which asset would you choose to draw if you know you have to draw 200 more assets? So obviously the calculations will change depending on how you draw your assets. Many of you would find that this type of asset looks far nicer than these, but this type of asset would take me closer to 45 minutes to make, which I don't like, and it generally forces me to be more careful when staging the scene, so that I end up with this and not this. Maybe that would be worth it to you, but in my case it isn't. As a side note to all of this, I don't think there's any problem in actually skipping the line art for assets that are really far into the background. I think it actually tends to look nicer in many cases. As we can see even in this scene, the hills here actually look kind of nice. Just because you do use line art doesn't mean you have to do it for all assets. Sometimes, I guess you just have to do what feels right. Thanks for watching. Bye.